Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is a review of the radiological protection landscape in Canada. I'm Lynn McDonald, the manager training here at the Institute, and my other title is Liaison Scientist. So during the webinar today, we ask that during the presentation that the audio and video be from the presenter only. To turn on closed captions, go to More, Language and Speech, turn on live captions. Please use the chat feature for any discussions and post questions arriving from the content in the Q&A. This will help us to find your questions for a lot of Q&A portion while allowing people to have a conversation in the chat. As the webinar is only 40 minutes in length, and is immediately followed by our wellness presentation, time may not permit for us to answer them all during the webinar. And to be honest, with the length of the webinar today, that it may be that we'll have to take them back and post the answers later. We will post those on the website along with a video recording and a copy of the slides, and this will be under education webinars on our website. In about a week's time, I'll send out a confirmation of attendance email to everyone that came to the live portion. And in that communication, I'll have a link as to where to find the video and the associated documentation. And we'll also have in that the topics in the webinar and the length of time spent, because some people wish to send those in to the professional associations. So what we're going to do today is take a look at the different ionizing radiation effect categories, the International System of Radiological Protection, just to get an idea of what the international recommendations are. And then we'll take a look at the regulatory structure within Canada for nuclear, X-ray, norm, and for radon. So it's a bit ambitious, and we can't go into depth with any one of the topics because it's an overview of the whole thing. So we'll be going through a legislative review and taking a look in different jurisdictions what some of the dose limits and things are. And then at the 40-minute mark, we'll move on to our movement break with Charmaine Wong from Jihong Tai Chi and Qigong in Richmond Hill, Ontario. So with ionizing radiation, there are two main types of effects that can happen. And I'm going back through this because it's important to understand in terms of how things are regulated, that the fact that there's these two different types of effects that can occur. There are one called tissue effects. More commonly, probably familiar to people is the term deterministic effects, but it's being moved over to the term tissue effects. That what happens with deterministic or tissue effects is that once you have a certain amount of ionizing radiation, that it's guaranteed that this effect is going to happen. So there's a threshold dose, and once you're over that amount of energy be deposited in the skin, you will get these effects. The dose can be different for person to person, at which the threshold dose, I mean. And one thing about these tissue or deterministic effects is that as you increase the dose, once you're past the threshold, then the effect gets worse. So for an example, when we look at solar radiation, a deterministic effect of solar radiation would be skin reddening or sunburn. Whereas stochastic effects is that your radiation dose increases the risk of getting the effect. That it's not a certainty it's going to happen. It's the more you're exposed to whatever's causing the effect, the more likely it is you're going to get that effect. And as dose increases, the risk increases. You don't end up with necessarily a worse outcome. It's that you're increasing your risk. So if we look at solar radiation, for example, going back to that example, the stochastic effects from solar radiation would be skin cancers. So you can be exposed to a lot of solar radiation and not get skin cancer, but the more you expose yourself to, the more likely it's going to happen. And how bad your case of cancer is not related to how many exposures you had. It's determined by the type. So in terms of global radiation protection, there's an organization called the ICRP, the International Commission on Radiological Protection. It's an independent organization that puts out publications to support ionizing radiation protection around the world. Regulators such as the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and many radiation protection professionals draw guidance from its publications. One document frequently referenced in the radiation protection community is the 2007 recommendations of the International Commission on Radiological Protection. But what's it recommending for? And what it is for a system of radiological protection. And if you dig a bit deeper into the documents, they have three fundamental principles, which are the justification principle, which is any decision that alters the radiation exposure situation should do more good than harm. The limitation principle, which is the total dose to any individual from regulated sources in planned exposure situations other than medical exposures of patients, should not exceed the appropriate limits specified by the Commission. And the optimization principle, which is also known as the ALARA principle. The likelihood of incurring exposure, the number of people exposed, and the magnitude of their individual doses should all be kept as low as reasonably achievable, taking into account economic and societal factors. Now, if we go back to those two different types of effects that can happen, our tissue effects and stochastic effects, when we take a look at things like the limitation principle, where you have dose limits, that's talking about, as long as things have to be below those dose limits, then you're not going to get those tissue effects happening. But this ALARA principle, the optimization principle, it is derived the concept that you have to keep them well below dose limits, as low as you reasonably can, taking into account economic and societal factors. It comes from something called the linear non-threshold theory. Now, in radiation protection, we can't really do experiments on humans. It wouldn't be ethical to be doing experiments on humans and say things like, let's give you a low dose of radiation over your life and see if you get cancer, right? So when we look at these stochastic effects, risk-based effects, there's not large population studies done on like across the globe on low dose radiation exposures. What we do have are some incidents where, unfortunately, the populations of people were exposed to large amounts of radiation all at once, acute exposures, and you can take a look at the cancer rates and how they're related, like the more dose they got, their increase in cancer risk. So for these stochastic effects, the largest population that has been studied in this are the Japanese nuclear bomb survivors, but there are some other populations that may have gotten medical doses, things like that are studied. They find that the response is linear, that the more dose you get, the more cancer risk you have. Now, it's not known down at this lower end what exactly happens. So there's different assumptions that could be made. There's different models out there. The one that the ICRP and countries like Canada that follow the ICRP use to estimate risk is what's called linear non-threshold. So it's a theoretical model. It's using conservative mindset because it's not known what's happened at low doses. So the assumption is that linear property that happens at high doses, that behaves that way all the way down to zero, and that there's no threshold under which there's no increased risk to cancer. But see, that's not 100% known, but that's the assumption made. So the assumption made is that a little dose gives you a small increase in risk. There are other thoughts out there that there might be a threshold, that it could be that a little bit of dose might actually prime your immune system. It could be that it's actually worse. There are different ones, but the ones that's used by the ICRP, and because Canada adopts it for the most part, different jurisdictions do, that it's assumed that it's linear right down to zero. Now, in the ICRP's, that document 103, that they explained that when you're looking at setting up regulations for a jurisdiction, right, that you have to look at different exposure categories, that there's planned exposure where you have deliberate introduction and operation of sources, like in different workplaces or in medical. And there could be anticipated to happen effects and not anticipated to happen effects. So things, if you had a medical situation, you plan to give the patient a certain dose for radiation therapy or for imaging, that type of thing. And then there could be non-anticipated to happen things, like if something spills, in nuclear medicine or things like that. It could happen, or a major spill. There might be minor spills expected, but not major ones. There needs to be planning around emergency situations. So it could be during planned situations, malicious acts, or other unexpected events. And for existing situations, so we live on a radioactive planet, that there are isotopes in the ground that are radioactive, give off ionizing radiation. There's radiation that comes from space, the ionizing radiation from space. So there are certain things that they already exist there. And then there are situations where humans may have contaminated an area and that's been there for a while, and that might be considered an existing situation. So, and then there's a decision to take control of that and do something with it. So there's different exposure categories when jurisdictions are looking at setting in radiological plants. We're going to talk mostly today, when we're looking at dose limits and legislations, about planned. We are going to talk a little bit when we start talking about norm and radon about existing. There's not time and scope today to talk about emergency situations. Now, in terms of levels of radiological protection within the ICRP 103, when they're looking at it, that sometimes what you're going to see, or I guess the ICRP whole series of documents, because they have many, many documents, there's some that have dose limits where, you know, these are the absolute, that when you're setting up your regulations as a jurisdiction, you shouldn't be going over those dose limits at all. And then there's constraints and reference levels. And the difference, and this is like, if you're familiar with radon, that it's usually a becquerel per cubic meter, and you have guidelines and recommendations, whereas dose limits are typically in things like millisieverts or rem or rad or gray. And the difference between when we talk dose limits and when we talk about reference levels is that with the dose limits, you're taking a look at protecting individual workers from occupational exposures and people from public exposures. And this is regulated sources for planned exposure situations, whereas the constraints and reference levels, you're still looking at the same type of exposure protections, but this is from a source in all exposure situations, including existing ones and emergency ones, well, existing ones. So that's why you see that difference between how things are expected around radon when we get to that, and worker dose limits. Now, we're going to take a look, especially when we get into the X-ray, we're going to be talking about different types of what's the legislation referring to? Is it going to be occupational or medical? And what it's coming back to when we get to those slides is that occupational exposures, when we're talking about a workplace having a source of ionizing radiation. Public exposures, we're talking about members of the public, people who are not designated as X-ray or radiation or nuclear workers. And then medical exposures would be for imaging or diagnostic or treatment purposes, that you're exposing people to radiation. So when we get along further, we'll be talking about occupational versus medical. It's coming back to here. In terms of the ICRP's recommended dose limits, that what they have, there's different types of limits. If you go in our previous webinars, we can't get into the units and things that we do have previous webinars. We talk about units like understanding radiations and measurement systems and things. So if you don't have that background, we do have resources on our website to cover it. But basically our dose, which is looking at an amount of energy and its implications when it arrives in the human body. And there's different unit systems. And here, in terms of millisieverts for the ICRP, we have 20 millisieverts per year, averaged over 5 years. So basically 100 millisieverts over 5 years, with no 1 year going over 50 for workers that are designated as working with the sources. 20 millisieverts per year averaged, or like that they acknowledge that they're working with the sources. 20 millisieverts per year averaged over defined periods of 5 years, no 1 year going over 50 for the eye. If you look in 103, it's going to have different, but they put out an update in publication 118. So publication 118 gave an update for Lens of the Eye. One thing to note about this Lens of the Eye is that there's another document called the International Basic Safety Standards published by the IAEA, which is an organization that collaborates and puts out information as well. And they use this Lens of the Eye, but they additionally have for those 16 to 18 years old, the dose limit for the Lens of the Eye be 20 millisieverts per year. Not averaged over 5 years, just 20 millisieverts per year. The equivalent dose to the skin, 500 millisieverts, and to the hands and feet, 500 millisieverts. And then for the public, the effective dose is 1 millisievert per year. For the Lens of the Eye, 15 millisieverts per year. For the skin, 50 millisieverts per year. Now, we do have another webinar that goes into the radiation protection regulatory structure in Canada in more detail. But I just tried to put it all in one slide, and there's nuances to it, right? There's exceptions, and sometimes the jurisdiction is this and sometimes it's that. So if you're setting up your own radiation protection program at your workplace, you need to go into the regulations and read the definitions and make sure that it does apply to your workplace. That being said, this is the general concept of how it works. So if it's nuclear and X-rays that are over 1 mega electron volt, not including norm unless it's part of the nuclear fuel cycle or being imported or exported. And then there's some exceptions for things like nuclear submarines owned by other countries, things like that. But I don't have time in 40 minutes to cover all the little exceptions of every one of these. But if it's this situation, the jurisdiction is federal and the regulator is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for all things under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. And then it's Transport Canada for the transport, anybody that has anything to do with the transport of the materials under the Transportation Dangerous Goods Act. Nuclear materials are Class 7 dangerous goods. Now, if it's X-ray under 1 mega electron volt, and it's being manufactured, sold, imported, or exported, or leased, it's the federal government as well, but it's the Health Canada, and in particular the Radiation Protection Bureaus that deals with it under the Radiation Emitting Devices Act. And I'll give more information on each of these in the following slides. If it's X-ray under 1 mega electron volt, once it's installed at a workplace, then the jurisdiction is the province, the territory, or for federally regulated workplaces, that it is the federal government, but it's not the CNSC or Transport Canada, it's Employment and Social Development Canada. And typically the legislation that applies is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but we do have follow slides where it's broken down, but some have standalone legislations. For naturally occurring radioactive material, if you're handling or disposing of it, but it's not part of the nuclear fuel cycle, then it falls under the province, territory, or again, under the Canada Labour Code for federally regulated workplaces. You'll typically find information in the Occupational Health and Safety Acts or Environmental Protection Acts. For norm, where you're doing transport and it's not part of the nuclear fuel cycle, that it's federal government and it's the CNSC, but it's not, you don't have to have a license if it's norm and not part of the, if it's a situation, but you do have to follow the Packaging and Transport of Nuclear Substance Regulations 2015, and then the Transportation Dangerous Goods Regulations from Transport Canada. For radon, if you don't have a license with the CNSC, then what follows is provincial, territorial, federal. That again, it's the same situation where it's the province, territory, or Employment and Social Development Canada. If it's occupational, you would look under general duty clauses for the most part, and there's some building codes that go into that. Now, in terms of just keeping an eye on my time. In terms of the legislation, I'm going to have to flip through this fairly quickly because there's a lot here. So I apologize again. Typically, we have more time to do some Q&A and chat. But in terms of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the large piece of legislation is the Nuclear Safety Control Act. You're protecting the people, the environment, and national security. The responsible people in this situation for everything is the applicant authority, the radiation safety officer. That the radiation safety officer is responsible on a day-to-day basis for taking care of the radiation protection program. Do you need a license or a registration? It's called a license, that you do need a license. There's a question there quickly. I will be putting out the slide deck with all its links as soon as the video is ready and goes out. So it'll be sometime next week. So you can see here the dose limits, and you can flip back that they're pretty much in alignment with what we see from the ICRP. For organs and tissues as well, that they're pretty much in alignment there. They might just be worded a little bit differently. Now, the Radiation Emitting Devices Act, you're not going to see dose limits and things for that. What it is, this is for things that are not regulated by nuclear or vehicles. So it sets standards for all radiation emitting devices when you do your manufacture, import, sale, resale, lease, I missed a comma there, of new equipment within Canada. Devices that emit X-rays, microwaves, laser beams, radio waves, so it's non-ionizing and ionizing. Excludes those regulated by CNSC and motor vehicles. And it has to do with labeling, emissions, construction, and performance. The regulator is Health Canada, again, looking at the Radiation Protection Bureau if you're looking for guidance on it. And basically, after the initial acceptance of the equipment and it's installed in a workplace, then it falls to the provincial, territorial, federal jurisdiction for federal workplaces. So this is very specifically for people that are offering that to workplaces to buy, sell, lease, import. Now, here's where things get large. Because we have 14 jurisdictions in Canada, in terms of X-ray, we have the 10 provinces, the 3 territories, and federally regulated workplaces, right? They each have their own ministry or department that take care of it, and they have their acts and regulations. I'm not going to just sit here and read them out, that this document will be provided to everyone after the fact. There's your different things that sometimes it's in the occupational health and safety regulations. Sometimes they have their own specific one. The New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia do not currently have specific regulations. So workplaces in those areas, that what they would do is follow best practices in terms of setting up a protection program and dose limits and things. It doesn't mean that it's not covered. It would be covered under the general duty clauses of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So again, that Northwest Territories and Nunavut, that they share an organization that helps support, but they each have their own act, which are very similar, but it's listed on their website separately. With Ontario, that they have 2 separate sets of legislation. Regulation 861 is for worker safety, whereas the HARP Act, which is what we colloquially call it in Ontario, is Regulation 543, and that has to do with patient safety. But the workers in places that fall under the protection of the HARP Act, that they are still protected by Regulation 861. So if you are someplace that does human health care in Ontario, that there are sections of 861 that are put into 543, but other sections still apply. I'll note that there's a Regulation for 2021 under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario. So it was just put in 2021, and it has to do with the requirements for reporting incidents. So we put that in there as well. Again, Prince Edward Island, nothing specific. We have Quebec. With the federally regulated workplaces, that they do have the Canadian Occupational Health and Safety Regulations has a section on X-ray. But what it does, it refers out to the Health Canada safety codes. And the safety codes look at different applications. So things like large medical facilities, dental, industrial, analytical, things like that, and they have specific expectations within each of the safety codes. Some of the provinces also adopt the safety codes as something that's expected to be followed. And we have a slide later on to say which ones follow the safety codes. Okay, now what I've done for X-ray is take a look at the jurisdiction. So we're going to have a number of slides that take a look at some little pieces. We could continue on and have many, many slides and go through, but the time was limited. So we just picked out some salient points to do a comparison of the different provinces, territories, and the federally regulated workplaces. So if you are interested, you're in one of these specific province, this isn't all the information that's in your legislation. You really should pull it out and read it. This is just a little sampling of the type of information you might find there. So in different regulations, they have different names for the equipment. For things like designated radiation equipment, it might be X-ray machine, X-ray equipment source. So depending on, typically in your regulations, you find definitions at the start, and they'll tell you what it is that's being regulated. Sometimes you kind of have to read through the regulation and you see it called that over and over again. Now, in terms of the different exposure types they look for, different provinces, sometimes the regulation talks about occupational mainly, and this is referring back to the regulations we had in the previous slides. There may be other regulation that's not dedicated to ionizing radiation where things are mentioned. It's not to say it's not regulated at all. These slides that are created here are specifically with the legislation that were linked in the overall legislation. So some of them are mainly focused on occupational, some of them combine both occupational and medical. And then on Ontario, we have 861 for occupational and 543 for medical. Now, in some provinces, it is required that you register your X-ray equipment. In other jurisdictions, I should say, out of respect for the territories and federally regulated workplaces, sorry. And in some jurisdictions that you don't need to register the equipment. Sometimes they don't call it registration. They might call it notification and a plan submission. Other places, it's lab permit. And there are some where it's like on request. You have to give the information that would be typically required in a registration. But it's only if the ministry or department requests it. So those were marked as no on this because it's not something you only need that upon request. In terms of reference out to the Health Canada safety codes that Alberta, British Columbia, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Saskatchewan, Yukon, and federally regulated workplaces, that yes, that there is specific mention of, for this type of equipment, you follow this safety code or the newest version of it. Ontario 543 has a reference out to a specific safety code for shielding of X-ray equipment. Now, in terms of names for people in the legislation, so what was done here was going through the legislation, who is it do they mention is responsible for the radiation protection program? Things like keeping track of worker doses and keeping records, who is mentioned. So in some places, it says the employer. Some cases, it says the owner of the equipment. In some places, they give very specific names, so the responsible person, the radiation protection officer. In some places, the legislation is written so that it's not really specific as to who is responsible to do those things, just that those things must be done. And then with the federally regulated workplaces, there are quite a number of safety codes, and you'd have to go through and check each one for your type of equipment. In terms of worker dose limits, that they change, the regulations are quite different from place to place. You'll notice the Yukon is blank. In the regulations, they refer to table 3, or sorry, I think it's table 1, and I could not find table 1 anywhere. So there's a PDF copy that's on their website. So if anybody has a copy of table 1 from the Yukon, you can email me at info@radiationsafety.ca and send it over to me. I'll put it in this document for everybody when it's time to come out. But basically, you can see that some of them are following similar to what the ICRP is recommending. Other ones are different, but remember that these dose limits are maximum doses that people should be getting, workers should be getting. And especially for a lot of the legislation, that if you look at it, it says in addition to the dose limits, you should be keeping your doses as low as reasonably achievable, as low as reasonably practicable. I know that at least one place said that, but much of the legislation or the safety codes refer back to that ALARA principle. So even if they're slightly different, workplaces should be keeping doses as low as reasonably achievable to avoid or raising the risk to workers for stochastic effects. Public dose limits, again, are quite different from place to place. The units vary. They typically are 1 year. Oh, sorry, there's an error here. That was copied and pasted. That should be, pretty sure Alberta's 1 millisievert. I'll fix that before it's sent out. Yeah, I think this was cut and pasted wrong. These two. I'll check and make sure, and I'll make sure that is corrected. And on the video, I will put a note on the slide to put the correction on here. For pregnancy, it's typically the recommendation. It's around 4 millisieverts for balance 5. For I-dose limits that Alberta has in place, pretty much the recommendations, the ICRP that are in there, as well as British Columbia. Now, so that's for X-ray. So I could probably spend 2 hours going through more and more details, the X-ray regulations. They are quite varied. How they look at things are very, very different in terms of how the legislation is structured across the country. So with respect to time, again, just taking a look here, time to move on to NORM, which is naturally occurring radioactive material. Now, as I said, we live on a radioactive planet, that we cannot get doses down to 0 if we didn't have it's part of life on Earth. So there is naturally occurring radioactive material out there. And it is, unless it's part of the nuclear fuel cycle or the other exceptions listed earlier on, that it's the jurisdictions that we talked about, the 10 provinces, the 3 territories, or federally regulated workplaces that have jurisdiction. Now, that, as you can see with X-ray, can lead to a lot of different variation in regulations and expectations. Now, to help with this and to help with the X-ray regulation as well, there is an organization called the Federal Provincial Territorial Regulation Radiation Protection Committee. So there's a group of people, and they meet every once in a while to talk about basically harmonization or looking at how they can work together to have some harmonization of some of these expectations. Now, with naturally occurring radioactive material, it's a bit important because often it's transported around, right? So one of the sets of documents that this committee put out, so you can see the name of them here, are Federal Provincial Territorial Radiation Protection Committee, that they have a set of documents. One is the Canadian Guidelines for the Management of Naturally Occurring Radioactive Material. And then there's the Canadian Guidelines for the Management of Naturally Occurring Radioactive Material NORM, Volume 3, Transportation. And you may go, where's Volume 2? Volume 3 is this original document's been around for a bit. So you can see 2011. This one was put out in 2021. And then this document is going to be basically deprecated. It's going to be set to the side, and there'll be Volume 1 for all NORM except for radon, and there's going to be Volume 2, which is radon. Okay, so this one's out right now. It has quite a nice table in it. I couldn't have put it on the whole slide. It's too large to get all the detail on. But basically, it has a nice table in it that explains what jurisdiction everything's in terms of norm. So it's very helpful in terms of different norm. So taking a look at that, these are not legislation, right? These are recommendations and guidelines. Because again, we're taking a look at existing exposure situations. We're taking a look at, we have different jurisdictions. This committee is not a regulator in Canada. It's a group of people that represent different government agencies and things like that put together recommendations, and then it's up to that jurisdiction to determine whether or not they want to put that into law or just keep it as a guideline or recommendation. So from the norm guidelines, that they do have recommended dose limits, and if you read the norm guidelines, if you go through again this first document, that they mention the ICRP and they talk about dose limits and they talk about that radiation protection program. So you can see that they have an annual dose limit of 20, but when you read into it, it's that averaged over 5 years thing of 100, and there's some little qualifiers there, and then members of the public. Now, so with that, I know it's kind of it's not going into the norm guidelines in detail. Again, we have a day-long course on that to go through every one of those things. Now, with radon. So radon is the top source of ionizing radiation exposure from background radiation to Canadians. And for most of us, it would be your top, potentially the top amount of ionizing radiation that you're going to get in a year, if you, especially if your home has never been tested, you don't know, and you're sitting in a house that has high levels of radon, right? You test your home, you mitigate it, you're probably bringing your levels down quite a bit. The number one, what you're increasing your risk for if you're sitting around in high levels of radon is lung cancer. And so it's the second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking, and the primary cause of lung cancer in people who do not smoke. The ICRP has a publication that has recommendations in it in terms of limits, and so does the World Health Organization, and there's links to them here. And both those, when they're putting out recommendations for countries setting guidelines, again, because this is an exposure situation, you're not going to eliminate radon from the surface, from buildings and stuff completely because of the uranium in the soil, that they recommend countries set guidelines between 100 becquerel per cubic meter, and a becquerel is the rate of radioactive decay, so how many radioactive decays in a cubic meter of air. So their range is 100 becquerel per cubic meter to 300 becquerel per cubic meter, because some countries have more uranium and sources of radon in their soil than others, right? And some constructions of buildings, when they're looking at a whole country, how the buildings are constructed and things, the expectation for mitigation and things that it's different around the world. And when we look at Health Canada's recommendation for people is 200 becquerel per cubic meter of air. And what that is saying is that you should be doing remediation at that point. And if you go onto Health Canada's site, they tell you like how long of a period of time you have if you're at that level, if you test your home or your workplace, how long you should wait before completing that remediation. Now, in terms of it being law, this is a guideline, right? So these are guidelines. It's not the law in Canada that people have to fix their home if it gets there. But there is guidance in building codes, and the building codes again are for each jurisdiction. There's a link here on Canada.ca. They have a really nice table that shows the different jurisdictions and the state of radon and building codes. So rather than reproduce it here, it's simpler just to go out to the link. But there's a mention of things like having soil gas barriers to keep radon from out of your home. the requirements for radon rough-ins with a stub, so that if it is tested high, that you would be able to easily put in a radon mitigation system. Passive subslab depressurization, where there's something there that just kind of takes the air in, out, but no fan attached, basically, or active subslab depressurization, where the air is being sucked out from under the slab. So again, if you're interested in this, this will be a resource, and this will be sent out next week. Health Canada also has resources for homeowners and for public buildings as to how to best deal with radon in those two different building types. And we do have a number of webinars on radon that go into this stuff in more detail. And we have webinars on norm as well that go into norm in more detail. So taking a look at the time, I'm right on time to finish up. So we don't have time to go through the Q&A. We have one person that has their hand up. Vipin, if you can either type your question in the chat or in the Q&A, I'll write up the answer and make sure that it gets put into the Q&A document that'll be produced as a result of the webinar. So with that, so again, apologize. I wanted to get through. It's such a broad topic. I had a feeling it wouldn't get to the Q&A. I'm sorry about that. But what we're going to do now, so I will take any of the Q&A, just type them into the Q&A if you can see it. If not, put it in the chat. We'll gather them up. We'll create a document. We'll put it out there. So next, what we're going to, just if you do have questions after this webinar or anytime in the future, that we have a free information service. If you know it's a matter of finding some materials, some resources, a simple explanation of something, that is free. If it's something that's going to take, you know, more than a half an hour or an hour, then it would become a consulting project. But if you do have questions about ionizing or non-ionizing radiation, feel free to reach out to us. We have a few different scientists on staff and health physicists. So 1-800-263-5803 and info@radiationsafety.ca. We also have quite a number of free resources on our main website, and we have some free e-learning courses as well on our e-learning portal. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Charmaine Wong of Jihong, Tai Chi, and Qigong in Richmond Hill, Ontario. That as part of our radiation safety and wellness webinar series, we're not just concerned about the impacts of radiation, we're concerned about whole body wellness. So we're going to turn it over to Charmaine, and it's beginner Tai Chi. Hopefully you'll be able to stay with us and at least do some stretching. We do realize that it's lunchtime for a lot of people and that some of you may have to go. But I'll turn it over. And if Charmaine is very, very small on your screen, if you go down by her name, that there's a little thing that you can click to make her larger. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Charmaine's going to share her music, which makes it large, but you can click on it's a little symbol beside her name and it will make it large.
So thank you for having us back. Now we're going to do some beginner Tai Chi, as Lynn mentioned. Let's start with some warm-up exercises. All right, so this is going to be a good exercise for you. Simple enough, the very first move. So I'm going to be facing the camera this way, and maybe I'm your mirror image. I don't know if that is the way it works. When I go this side, it is your left, and when I go this side, this is going to be your right. All right. So now let's just get started with standing up, and then putting your feet shoulder width apart, with the knees slightly bent. You don't want to lock your knee joints. Now the very first move is pretty easy. So you just interlace your fingers, palms facing up, and then start raising the palms up to about chest high. Then turn the palms upright facing the ceiling as you stretch up. Whole spine extended. Then you're going to relax your arms, let the fingers go, open the arms sideways, and as you come down, you sit down a little bit, not really sitting down, but you kind of bend your knees and your hip joints. And then we're going to repeat. All right, now all Tai Chi and Qigong moves are done slowly. Now, so as you stretch up, take a deep and slow breath in. And then as you relax and lower your arms, you slowly exhale. Try to keep everything slow, even your breathing. And then let's repeat that again. Slow, deep breath in. And slowly exhale. Now, this move is simple enough to remember. So if you like, this is a move that you can do after you sit for a while on your chair. Every hour or so, you stand up and do this. That will help with your spine, that will calm your stress. Let's do that a couple more times. Slow, deep breath in. And slowly breathe out. One more time. Keep your shoulders down, relaxed. Breathe in. Breathe out. Okay. Now after we move down the arms, you can just relax your arms, stand back up, put the feet back together. Now let's do a second exercise. This is one of the basic moves in Tai Chi. So when we begin, we step out to about shoulder width apart with our feet. Now you open your arms, palms facing down, stretch out with the arms forming a big V shape. And then as you go up there, you drop down a little bit, sit down, dropping your elbows, relaxing your shoulders. And then as the arms continue to go down, you stand back up. Let's do that again. Stretch open. The arms should form roughly about 150 degrees, not completely wide open because that would not make your shoulders feel comfortable. And then we come down. You want to have the shoulders relaxed, which means forming about 150 degrees with your arms would roughly have that effect. And then as you sit down, you think about having your shoulders and elbows relaxed and dropping down. And then stand back up. Again. Do natural breathing, especially as you reach up. That's a good place to breathe in and slowly breathe out as you come down. Relaxing your shoulders and elbows. Let's do that a couple more times. Breathe in. Relax. Sit down. Stand up. Last time. Okay, we're going to stand back up, relax your arms, and put your feet together. All right. Now, after those couple of warming up moves, we're going to do some real Tai Chi. But let's practice our horse stance. As you know, Tai Chi originates from a martial art. So horse stance, being like you kind of do a squat, is very, very important in a lot of martial arts, right? Now, with your feet about shoulder width apart or slightly wider if you can sit lower, let's try to do a couple of squats going down, and I'll turn sideways to show you how it should look like. It's down, coming back up. You can put your hands around your hip joints at the upper portion of your legs and stand back up. Now I'm going to turn sideways to show you how it should look like. You can still face the screen. So when you go down, make sure you have the knee joints bent as well as the hip joints bent. And you can come back up. Now I'm going to show you a wrong method. This is wrong. You bend the knees without bending the hip joints, what you should do is go back by keeping your body straight, more or less. All right? Now let's try that again. Go down. If you just bend your knees without bending your hip joints, it's going to put too much pressure to your knees, which would not be good for your hip joints. Let's do that a couple more times, and we're going to do the actual Tai Chi move that requires a horse stance. And one last time. And back up. All right. Now, we're going to do the Tai Chi move that's called cloud hands, or waving your hands like clouds. So what it looks like from the hands point of view is that it's going to go sideways with one hand up, one hand down. That you can follow along. You can go either side if you want to follow me from a mirror image point of view. Now you're going to move to your right with your right hand up. Now you're going to move back to your left with your left hand up. So the upper hand kind of like floats like clouds. The lower hand, you just have it in a big round circle, with the palm facing down. Let's do that a few more times. And then we're going to add our footwork. You should feel relaxed with your shoulders and elbows, yet you want to feel like you are very energized, which means you don't want to be doing like this, right? You want to feel like you're standing up tall, very energized, very inflated, pumped up, but shoulders and elbows down. All right, now let's go back to this side. Okay, now we're gonna add our footwork. I'm gonna move a little bit to this side so that I can move a couple of steps, a few steps this way, and then we're gonna move back, all right? Now first, we're gonna sit down a little bit, forming a little bit of that horse stance. You don't have to go very low to begin with, right? Like we can save our legs for now. And then we're gonna put our right hand up, your right hand up, because we're going this side, so this hand has to be up. All right, now we're going to step a little bit, and then we're going to move to the right side. We're going to switch the hands and step closer with your left leg. And then we're going to move back so that our weight is on our left foot. We're going to switch our hands so that we can step our right foot. And we can repeat. If you can, just try to stay in a squatted position, at least a slight squat position. I'm gonna finish with this step, and I'm gonna step back towards that side, all right? So step open your left foot a little bit and move to your left side. We're gonna switch our hands, move back, switch our hands and move. Now try to stay upright as you move. You don't want to rock your body side to side and lean your body. Okay, let's do that one last time. All right, now we're going to step back that side. Switch and step. Switch your hands and step. Now ideally, we're going to have our feet placed on the floor softly, lightly. That requires stronger legs. Actually, let's do one more time, going that way. All right, so we can go back more towards the middle of the camera. Softly place down your left foot and softly place down your right foot. I'm going to take one final step. Okay, now we're just going to let go, relax our arms and stand back up. All right, now the next move we're going to do is called parting wild horse's mane. And this requires a different stance, which is called a bow stance. In the Yang style Tai Chi, the bow stance is like this, similar to in the gym, you go for a lunge forward. So the front leg going forward like this, the back leg at the back, a little bit separated into about shoulder width apart. The back leg is a little bit straighter than the front leg, not to really lock the knee, but you don't want to go down like this. It's not exactly like a lunge like that, but you want to stand up so that it's stretched out. Okay, now this is a bow stance. Now let's switch our legs and try that again. Again, both the horse stance and the bow stance would require you to have strong legs. So that's the way to train our lower body strength. All right, now let's try to step forward into a bow stance from standing. Okay, now let's start with putting this leg forward. So first of all, I have to turn this side, this foot, so that it becomes a 45 degrees. It's going to be the back leg, which goes 45 degrees as a better support. Then we're going to step forward the front leg, and then the front toes pointing forward, and the body squared to the front. Let's try that on the other side. Let's turn this set of toes open to about 45 degrees. Let's pick up this foot and step forward, and with the toes pointing forward, and finally with the body squared, we form a bow stance. Let's do that a couple more times. One on each side, and then we're going to add our hands to do a couple of times. All right, so turn the toes, step forward, bow stance. All right, now one last time. Turn the toes, step forward, softly, hopefully, and another bow stance. Okay, now we're gonna just quickly practice the hands with the parting wild horse's mane. Let's practice both sides. It can be done on both left and right. So now here, when you turn your body slightly to your right with this hand, the right hand on top of the left hand. The top hand palm facing down, the bottom hand palm facing up. Now we're gonna open so that the bottom hand goes diagonally up to the opposite corner, and the upper hand just press down. Let's do the same side. We call this a hold ball, as if you're holding a ball on the side, a little bit at an angle to your side, and then you open the arms. Let's switch to the other side. Now again, this side, this hand becomes the top hand and the other hand at the bottom. Let's separate. The bottom hand goes up diagonally and the other hand just press down in the front. Let's do the same side one more time. Hold ball and parting wild horse's mane. All right, now let's quickly add our footwork to it. Now, let's start with the same side as we did our footwork just now. Let's turn your left toes to this side, 45 degrees, and shift our weight there so that we can put the other foot forward. Then we have this side of the holding ball, this hand on top, the other hand at the bottom. And then as we step and shift our weight, we do the arms like we did before. Let's do that one more time. Turn, hold ball, make sure your weight is on your left side now, then step and open. Okay, now let's do that on the other side. More times, turn. Your right hand over your left hand, move the weight to your right, step. And open as you shift most of your weight to the front foot. One more time. Turn the toes, shift the weight and whole ball. Step. Shift the weight to the front, about 70% of your weight on the front leg, and spread the arms. All right, I think that's all the time we have to do the actual Tai Chi moves. Before we sit back down, let's do a little bit of a cool down, all right? So now just place the palms facing up in front of you. Very relaxed, bring the arms up, breathe in. Circle the arms back down, palms pressing down, breathe out. Let's do that 2 more times. Breathe in. Breathe out. One last time. Breathe in. Breathe out. Okay, so that completes our exercise for today. So I'll turn it back to Lynn.
Thank you, Charmaine. It's very much appreciated. That we really thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. Thanks to everyone that was able to stay right to the end. Again, sorry for not having the time for the questions, but it's such a large topic that it was trying to get all those things in there. The materials will be sent out probably at some point next week, along with where the video is located. This will probably be our last webinar for a period of time because July and August, that there's a lot of things going on here at the Institute. So we'll probably be back emailing out again towards the end of August, the start of September, about the next webinar and this, and it'll be a new series for 2024, 2025. So thanks again to everyone, and hopefully we'll see you again in the future. So bye.